The morning sun cast gentle shadows across the Wildlife Rescue Center's compound as Dr. Rebecca Walsh adjusted her reading glasses and reviewed the latest medical reports. Her weathered hands, scarred from years of treating injured animals, trembled slightly as she turned the pages. The sanctuary buzzed with its usual symphony of rescued creatures, chattering monkeys, squawking parrots, and the occasional trumpet of elephants in the distance. Rebecca's phone buzzed insistently on her desk, displaying her home number. She hesitated before answering, knowing what awaited her on the other end. Her father's voice, once commanding and clear during his years as a construction foreman, now carried the uncertain quality that had become increasingly familiar over the past few months. Thomas Mitchell had built their family home with his own hands 43 years ago, every nail driven with precision and purpose. The same hands that had crafted kitchen cabinets and installed plumbing now struggled to remember how to tie shoelaces. Early onset dementia had crept into their lives like fog rolling in from the ocean, subtle at first, then increasingly dense and disorienting. The call was brief but concerning. Thomas had forgotten to take his morning medication again and seemed confused about whether Rebecca was coming home for dinner. She assured him she would be there soon, her heart heavy with the familiar weight of watching a brilliant man slowly disappear into the shadows of his own mind. Meanwhile, in the elephant rehabilitation wing, a crisis was unfolding. Kibo, a 3-month-old elephant calf, had been brought to the sanctuary 2 weeks earlier after being found orphaned and malnourished near a dried riverbed. The little elephant, barely 3 feet tall and weighing just over 200 pounds, had captured the hearts of every staff member with his playful trunk and curious brown eyes. However, the main rehabilitation facility was experiencing a critical infrastructure failure. A burst water pipe had flooded the elephant nursery, forcing immediate evacuations of all the young animals to temporary locations. The repair work would take at least 2 weeks, and with limited space at partner facilities, difficult decisions had to be made about placement. Dr. Sandra Williams, the sanctuary's director, approached Rebecca with an unusual request. Kibo needed specialized care due to his weakened immune system and required round-the-clock monitoring. The other facilities were either at capacity or lacked the medical expertise necessary for his delicate condition. Would Rebecca consider fostering the baby elephant at her home temporarily? The request was unprecedented, but not impossible. Rebecca's property included a large fenced yard, a converted barn that could serve as temporary shelter, and proximity to the veterinary clinic for emergencies. Most importantly, her experience with large mammals and medical training made her uniquely qualified to provide the specialized care Kibo needed. Rebecca's mind immediately went to her father. Thomas spent most of his days alone while she worked, often disoriented and sometimes agitated. His doctor had mentioned that interaction with animals could be therapeutic for dementia patients, providing comfort and routine. Perhaps Kibo's presence might offer unexpected benefits for both her father and the young elephant. After careful consideration and consultation with the sanctuary's board, Rebecca agreed to the arrangement. Emergency veterinary supplies were loaded into her truck alongside specialized elephant formula hay bales and medical equipment. Kibo would be transported to her home that evening under cover of darkness to minimize stress and avoid attracting unwanted attention from neighbors or media. The transport went smoothly. Kibo, sedated lightly for the journey, was carefully guided from the specialized trailer into the converted barn behind Rebecca's house. The space had been quickly modified with soft bedding, heating lamps, and secure fencing. By the time the elephant calf was settled in his temporary home, Thomas had been asleep for several hours, unaware of his new neighbor. Rebecca spent the night monitoring Kibo's vital signs and ensuring he adapted well to his new environment. The young elephant seemed remarkably calm, perhaps sensing the safety and care surrounding him. As dawn approached, she felt cautiously optimistic about the arrangement, though she remained uncertain about how her father would react to their unexpected guest. The first encounter came sooner than expected. Thomas had always been an early riser, a habit ingrained from decades of construction work, despite his cognitive decline. His internal clock remained remarkably consistent. He wandered into the kitchen at his usual 6:30, drawn by the familiar ritual of making morning coffee. As he stood at the window above the sink measuring coffee grounds with the careful precision of someone fighting to maintain familiar routine's movement in the yard caught his attention. Through the early morning mist, he could make out a large gray shape moving near the barn. His eyesight, compromised by cataracts and age, made it difficult to distinguish details. Thomas set down the coffee tin and squinted through the glass. The creature appeared to be roughly the size of a large dog, perhaps a Great Dane or St. Bernard. It moved slowly, deliberately, occasionally lowering its head to the ground as if sniffing or eating. In his confused mental state, the logical conclusion seemed obvious. Someone had left a dog in their yard. Concern, rather than fear, drove his next actions. Thomas had always been a dog lover, having raised several German Shepherds and Labrador Retrievers throughout his life. The idea that a lost or abandoned animal might be suffering in his yard troubled him deeply. He pulled on his work boots and jacket, moving with the determined purpose that still occasionally emerged despite his cognitive challenges. Opening the back door, Thomas stepped into the crisp morning air and approached the barn with careful, measured steps. The creature, Kibo, sensed his approach and looked up from the hay he had been sampling. Their eyes met across 15 feet of dewy grass, two beings equally uncertain about this unexpected encounter. Kibo had been hand-raised by humans since his rescue and showed no fear of people. His trunk, that marvelous appendage that Thomas's compromised vision couldn't quite comprehend, swayed gently as the elephant calf assessed this new human. To Thomas, the movement suggested a dog's tail, perhaps wagging in cautious greeting. What Thomas saw was a large gray dog with unusual proportions. His mind, seeking familiar patterns in an increasingly confusing world, imposed logical explanations on illogical observations. The trunk became a long snout, the large ears became floppy dog ears, and the massive feet became oversized paws. The identification felt certain, even comforting, in its familiarity. Thomas approached slowly, speaking in the gentle tone he had always used with animals. His voice carried decades of experience calming nervous dogs and building trust with frightened creatures. Kibo, recognizing the peaceful intention in the human's approach, remained still but alert. The moment of first contact was magical in its simplicity. Thomas extended his hand, palm open, allowing the dog to approach at its own pace. Kibo, curious about this new human, reached out with his trunk to investigate. The soft, warm touch of the elephant's trunk against Thomas's weathered palm sent a wave of joy through the elderly man's confused mind. In that instant, a bond formed that transcended species, age, and cognitive limitations. Thomas smiled broadly, the first genuine expression of happiness Rebecca had seen from him in months. The trunk's gentle exploration of his hand felt familiar, yet special, like meeting an old friend for the first time. Kibo, equally charmed by this gentle human's peaceful energy, stepped closer. His young mind, still forming associations and attachments, recognized safety and kindness in Thomas's presence. The elephant calf's natural inclination toward social bonding, typically directed toward his herd, focused entirely on this unexpected new companion. When Rebecca emerged from the barn an hour later, having completed her morning medical checks on Kibo, she found a scene that stopped her in her tracks. Her father sat cross-legged on the grass, his back against the barn wall, while Kibo stood contentedly beside him. Thomas's hand rested on the elephant's side, moving in slow, rhythmic strokes that seemed to soothe both man and animal. The sight filled Rebecca with conflicting emotions. Joy at seeing her father so peaceful and engaged battled with concern about the implications of his obvious misidentification of Kibo's species. She had planned to introduce them gradually with careful explanation and supervision. Instead, fate had arranged their meeting on its own terms. Thomas looked up as his daughter approached, his face radiating contentment. He began explaining how he had found this wonderful dog in their yard, describing the animal's gentle nature and unusual size. His words revealed both his deep affection for his new companion and his complete conviction that he was dealing with a canine friend. Rebecca faced a crucial decision in that moment. She could immediately correct her father's misunderstanding, potentially causing confusion, distress, or fear. Alternatively, she could allow the relationship to develop naturally, monitoring the situation carefully while her father found comfort in what he perceived as a simple friendship with a dog. The therapeutic benefits were already evident. Thomas seemed more alert, focused, and emotionally stable than she had seen him in weeks. His natural caregiving instincts, suppressed by the frustrations of his declining capabilities, had reawakened in response to Kibo's presence. The elephant calf, meanwhile, appeared completely comfortable with the arrangement, showing none of the stress indicators that concerned the veterinary team. Rebecca made her choice. She would allow the relationship to continue, observing carefully while letting her father experience the joy and purpose that Kibo's companionship clearly provided. The decision felt both risky and necessary, prioritizing emotional well-being over technical accuracy. That evening, Thomas insisted on staying outside until well after sunset, reluctant to leave his new friend alone. He had already given the elephant calf a name, Buddy, choosing something that reflected the instant connection he felt. The name suited both the relationship and Thomas's perception of their friendship. As darkness fell, Rebecca helped her father understand that Buddy needed to sleep in the barn for warmth and safety. Thomas accepted this explanation readily, though he insisted on checking on his friend one more time before going inside. Standing at the barn entrance, he spoke softly to Kibo in the loving tone reserved for cherished pets, promising to return first thing in the morning. Inside the house, Thomas talked excitedly about his discovery, describing Buddy's gentle nature and obvious intelligence. His animation and enthusiasm reminded Rebecca of the man he had been before dementia began stealing pieces of his personality. For the first time in months, her father seemed genuinely happy, engaged with life in a way that medical professionals had suggested might no longer be possible. Rebecca spent that evening researching the therapeutic benefits of animal-assisted therapy for dementia patients. Study after study confirmed what she was observing firsthand. Interaction with animals could reduce anxiety, improve mood, and even temporarily improve cognitive function in people with various forms of dementia. The unique nature of their situation, an elephant calf providing therapeutic benefits to a dementia patient who perceived him as a dog, was unprecedented. However, the fundamental principles remained the same. Unconditional affection, purposeful activity, and sensory stimulation could all contribute to improved quality of life for people struggling with cognitive decline. As she prepared for bed, Rebecca could hear her father moving around the house with more energy than he had shown in weeks. He was gathering supplies for Buddy's care, collecting old towels for bedding, and organizing treats for morning feeding. The purposeful activity gave structure to his thoughts and actions, creating the kind of meaningful routine that therapists recommended for dementia patients. Outside, Kibo settled into his temporary home with remarkable adaptability. The young elephant's natural resilience and social intelligence allowed him to thrive in this unusual living arrangement. His presence would prove to be as beneficial to Thomas as Thomas's companionship was therapeutic for the orphaned elephant. The following morning established a routine that would define the next 2 weeks of both their lives. Thomas woke before dawn, his internal clock driven by excitement rather than habit. He prepared coffee with unusual focus and care, his mind already anticipating the reunion with Buddy waiting in the backyard. Rebecca, monitoring the situation from her bedroom window, watched her father's transformation with wonder. The shuffle that had characterized his walk for months was replaced by purposeful strides. The confusion that typically clouded his morning routine gave way to clear, focused activity. The prospect of caring for Buddy had awakened dormant aspects of Thomas's personality that dementia had seemed to extinguish. The feeding routine became their first shared ritual. Thomas had always been methodical in his approach to animal care, and despite his cognitive challenges, those instincts remained intact. He approached Buddy's breakfast with the same careful attention he had once brought to measuring lumber or mixing concrete. Rebecca had left detailed feeding instructions that Thomas studied with intense concentration. However, his interpretation of those instructions reflected his perception of Buddy as an exceptionally large dog. When the guidelines called for specialized elephant formula, Thomas assumed it was merely premium food for a special breed. When they specified large quantities of hay and fresh vegetables, he nodded approvingly at the healthy diet recommended for such a substantial animal. Kibo, for his part, adapted remarkably well to Thomas's care. The young elephant's natural intelligence allowed him to understand and respond to human expectations, even when those expectations were based on misidentification of his species. When Thomas called him to breakfast, Kibo approached eagerly, his trunk reaching out to sample the carefully prepared meal. The feeding process created opportunities for bonding that neither species could have anticipated. Thomas's gentle patience as Kibo explored his food options demonstrated the same nurturing instincts he had shown when raising his own children decades earlier. The elephant calf's obvious appreciation for the care and attention reinforced Thomas's sense of purpose and competence. What struck Rebecca most profoundly was her father's adaptation to Buddy's unique dietary preferences, when traditional dog food was ignored in favor of hay and vegetables. Thomas didn't express confusion or frustration. Instead, he embraced what he interpreted as his new friend's sophisticated palate, proudly preparing elaborate salads of fresh greens and root vegetables. This adaptability revealed the remarkable plasticity of the human mind even when compromised by dementia. Thomas's love for his new companion allowed him to accept and accommodate differences that might have troubled a more rigid thinker. His heart guided him to appropriate care choices even when his cognitive understanding was fundamentally flawed. The days that followed established a rhythm of shared activities that enriched both their lives. Thomas would spend hours in the yard with Buddy, sometimes sitting quietly together, sometimes engaging in what he perceived as training sessions. His previous experience with dogs provided a framework for their interactions, even though Kibo's responses often surprised him. When Thomas attempted to teach traditional commands like sit and stay, Kibo's intelligence and eagerness to please produced remarkable results. The young elephant's natural inclination to follow instructions developed through his rehabilitation training at the sanctuary made him an exceptionally responsive student. Thomas interpreted this cooperation as evidence of Buddy's exceptional intelligence and breeding. The training sessions became a source of immense pride for Thomas. In a life increasingly defined by forgotten names and missed appointments, his success in communicating with Buddy represented a rare victory. Each correctly followed command restored a small piece of his confidence and sense of competence. Rebecca watched these sessions with fascination and concern. The relationship was clearly beneficial for both participants, but she worried about the long-term implications of her father's fundamental misunderstanding. She consulted with dementia specialists and animal behaviorists seeking guidance on whether intervention was necessary or advisable. The consensus among experts was surprisingly consistent. As long as both the human and animal remained safe and healthy, the therapeutic benefits of the relationship outweighed the problems created by the misidentification. The emotional well-being that Thomas derived from caring for Buddy was more important than correcting his cognitive error. As the days passed, the bond between Thomas and Kibo deepened into something profound and mutually enriching. Thomas began to confide in Buddy during their quiet moments together, sharing memories and concerns with the kind of trust typically reserved for lifelong friends. These one-sided conversations revealed the depth of Thomas's emotional struggles with his declining memory. He spoke about forgetting his late wife's face, about the frustration of losing words mid-sentence, about the fear of becoming a burden to his daughter. Kibo listened with the patience and non-judgmental attention that made him an ideal therapeutic companion. The elephant calf seemed to understand the emotional content of these conversations even without comprehending the words. His trunk would gently touch Thomas's shoulder or hand during moments of particular distress, offering comfort in the most natural and effective way possible. These gestures of support provided exactly the kind of unconditional acceptance that Thomas needed most. Evening became their most treasured time together. Thomas had always been musical, playing harmonica during his younger years as a form of relaxation after long days of physical labor. Dementia had robbed him of many pleasures, but his ability to play simple melodies remained intact. The first evening he brought his harmonica outside, Thomas was uncertain how Buddy would react to the music. Many dogs were sensitive to certain sounds, and he wanted to ensure his new friend would be comfortable. As the first notes of Amazing Grace floated across the evening air, he watched Buddy's response carefully. Kibo's reaction was extraordinary. The young elephant stood perfectly still, his ears forward, and alert his trunk, swaying gently to the rhythm of the melody. His obvious enjoyment and engagement encouraged Thomas to continue playing, eventually working through his entire repertoire of half-remembered songs. These musical sessions became the highlight of both their days. Thomas would play for 30 minutes or more each evening, his fingers finding melodies that his conscious mind could no longer fully recall. Kibo would stand nearby, sometimes touching Thomas's shoulder with his trunk, creating a bond that transcended species barriers through the universal language of music. Rebecca often watched these evening concerts from her kitchen window, tears streaming down her face as she witnessed the profound connection between her father and the young elephant. The scene embodied everything she had hoped for when she entered wildlife rehabilitation. The healing power of the human-animal bond made manifest in its most pure and beautiful form. The sleeping arrangements evolved naturally as the relationship deepened. Initially, Thomas would reluctantly leave Buddy in the barn each night, concerned about the separation, but accepting the necessity. However, as their bond strengthened, both man and elephant showed signs of distress at being apart. Kibo began following Thomas to the edge of the yard each evening, his trunk reaching out as if trying to bridge the gap between barn and house. Thomas would linger at the door, looking back repeatedly at his friend waiting alone in the shadows. The mutual reluctance to separate became increasingly obvious to Rebecca. Understanding the therapeutic value of their companionship, Rebecca made arrangements for Thomas to sleep in the converted barn with Kibo. She set up a comfortable camp bed and portable heater, creating a space where her father could remain close to Buddy throughout the night, while staying warm and safe. The arrangement proved beneficial for both of them. Thomas slept more peacefully than he had in months, comforted by Buddy's presence and the sense of purpose that came from serving as the elephant's nighttime guardian. Kibo, meanwhile, showed reduced signs of stress and anxiety that often plagued orphaned elephants separated from their social groups. Their nighttime conversations became some of the most poignant moments, Rebecca observed. Thomas would talk softly to Buddy about his fears and hopes, processing emotions that he struggled to express during daylight hours. The elephant's patient listening and gentle responses created a safe space for emotional healing that no human relationship had been able to provide. 2 weeks passed with remarkable speed each day, strengthening the bond between Thomas and Kibo while providing therapeutic benefits that exceeded everyone's expectations. Thomas showed consistent improvements in mood, cognitive function, and physical activity. His appetite increased, his sleep improved, and his overall engagement with life reached levels that his doctors had considered impossible. Kibo, meanwhile, thrived under Thomas's devoted care. The young elephant gained weight, his immune system strengthened, and his natural curiosity and playfulness blossomed. The stability and affection that Thomas provided created an ideal environment for emotional and physical recovery from the trauma of losing his herd. However, the temporary nature of the arrangement was always a shadow hanging over their happiness. The sanctuary's facilities were nearly ready for occupancy, and Kibo would soon need to return to join other young elephants in the formal rehabilitation program. The specialized socialization and training he required for eventual release could only be provided in the professional setting. Rebecca received the call on a Tuesday morning that she had been dreading for days. Dr. Williams informed her that the repairs were complete, and Kibo needed to return to the sanctuary by the end of the week. The news was expected, but still hit her like a physical blow, knowing what it would mean for her father. The decision of how and when to tell Thomas consumed Rebecca's thoughts for the entire day. His attachment to Buddy had become the central organizing principle of his daily existence. The prospect of separation would devastate him, potentially triggering the kind of decline that family members of dementia patients feared most. After consulting with her father's physician and a specialist in animal-assisted therapy, Rebecca developed a plan for gradually preparing Thomas for the transition. She would begin by explaining that Buddy needed to visit the animal hospital for specialized care, then gradually extend the duration of these visits until Thomas could accept a permanent arrangement. However, fate intervened before Rebecca could implement her careful strategy. Thomas's intuition, perhaps sharpened by his deep connection with Buddy, sensed the approaching change before anyone told him. He began spending even more time with the elephant, as if trying to store up memories against an uncertain future. On Wednesday evening, as Thomas played his harmonica in their usual spot beside the barn, his melodies carried a melancholic quality that hadn't been present before. Kibo seemed to sense his friend's emotional state, staying closer than usual and offering more frequent trunk touches of comfort and reassurance. Rebecca found them that evening sitting together in comfortable silence, both gazing up at the star-filled sky. The scene was so peaceful and complete that she almost couldn't bring herself to disturb them with the news of Kibo's impending departure. Instead, she joined them on the grass, creating a small family circle, united by love for the remarkable creature who had brought them together. Thursday morning brought the first signs of the transition process. Rebecca explained to her father that Buddy needed to visit the animal doctor for a special checkup that might require him to stay overnight. Thomas accepted this explanation with the trust he had always placed in his daughter's judgment, though his worry was evident in the extra attention he lavished on his friend throughout the day. The evening harmonica session lasted longer than usual, with Thomas playing every song he could remember while Kibo stood by his side. As darkness fell, Thomas seemed reluctant to end their time together, playing the same melodies repeatedly, as if trying to memorize the moment. Friday arrived with a crisp autumn clarity that made every detail sharp and poignant. Thomas spent the morning grooming Buddy with unusual care, brushing his skin with a soft cloth and ensuring his ears were clean. The attention seemed both loving preparation and desperate postponement of an inevitable goodbye. The transport truck arrived at precisely 2 o'clock, its specialized design immediately obvious to anyone with veterinary experience. Rebecca had prepared Thomas for its arrival, explaining that Buddy's visit to the animal hospital required special transportation due to his size and medical needs. As the sanctuary staff began preparing for Kibo's departure, something unexpected happened. Thomas, who had been watching the proceedings with mild confusion, suddenly seemed to see the young elephant with startling clarity. The fog of dementia lifted momentarily, and his vision sharpened with the intensity that sometimes accompanied moments of lucidity in neurological decline. For the first time since their initial meeting, Thomas truly saw Kibo as he was, not a giant dog, but a baby elephant. The trunk that had seemed like an unusual snout was revealed as the remarkable appendage it truly was. The ears that had appeared to be floppy and dog-like were obviously the massive mobile structures that characterized elephants. The feet that had seemed like oversized paws were clearly the broad padded foundations that supported one of nature's most magnificent creatures. The revelation hit Thomas with the force of sudden understanding, but rather than causing distress or confusion, it filled him with wonder and pride. He had been chosen by this magnificent creature for friendship and companionship. The trust that Kibo had placed in him was even more precious than he had realized. Standing beside the transport truck, Thomas reached out to touch Kibo's trunk one final time. The elephant calf, sensing the emotional weight of the moment, curled his trunk around Thomas's forearm in a gentle embrace that spoke volumes about their mutual affection. The words Thomas spoke were simple, but carried the weight of profound gratitude and love. He thanked Buddy for the gift of their friendship and expressed hope that they would see each other again. His voice remained steady, despite the tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Kibo's reluctance to enter the transport vehicle was immediate and obvious. The young elephant had formed such a strong attachment to Thomas that separation seemed impossible. He trumpeted softly, a sound of distress that echoed across the yard and pierced the hearts of everyone present. The sanctuary staff, experienced in managing difficult transitions, worked patiently to coax Kibo toward the truck. However, their efforts were unsuccessful until Thomas himself led the way, walking beside the elephant calf and speaking in soothing tones about the importance of the journey ahead. With Thomas's encouragement, Kibo finally entered the transport vehicle, though he continued to reach toward his human friend with his trunk until the doors closed between them. The sight of that searching trunk disappearing behind metal barriers marked the end of an extraordinary chapter in both their lives. As the truck pulled away from the house, Thomas stood in the yard waving until it disappeared from sight. His posture remained erect and dignified, though Rebecca could see the profound sadness in his shoulders and the way his hands trembled at his sides. The weeks that followed were difficult for Thomas, as Rebecca had anticipated. The structured routine that Buddy's presence had provided was gone, leaving empty hours that emphasized the silence and isolation that characterized so much of his daily existence. His mood declined, his appetite decreased, and the cognitive improvements he had experienced began to reverse. However, the memory of his friendship with Buddy remained remarkably intact, even as other recollections faded. Thomas would sit in the yard where they had spent so many hours together, his eyes focused on something beyond the present moment. During these times, his face would soften with remembered joy, and occasionally he would smile at some private memory of their time together. Rebecca maintained contact with the sanctuary, receiving regular updates on Kibo's progress and adjustment to his return. The young elephant had initially shown signs of distress at the separation from Thomas, but gradually adapted to life with other elephants his age. The social skills he had learned through his relationship with Thomas served him well in establishing connections with his own species. Months later, during one of Thomas's increasingly rare moments of clarity, Rebecca showed him photographs from their time with Buddy. His recognition was immediate, and his joy profound, though he struggled to find words to express the depth of his emotions. The photo album became one of Thomas's most treasured possessions, though his understanding of who was pictured gradually faded. Eventually, he would look at the images with appreciation for their obvious warmth and happiness without remembering the specific circumstances of their creation. On quiet evenings, Rebecca would sometimes play recordings of her father's harmonica sessions from that magical 2-week period. The music would cause Thomas to smile and occasionally hum along his fingers, moving in patterns that suggested muscle memory of melodies he could no longer consciously recall.